I guess you would say he came on strong.
LBJ was a force of nature. It was just a human dynamo.
If you walked in the room, you would know it if your eyes were closed and your back was turned. Oh my God, there's LBJ.
He was a tornado in pants. Larger than life.
The good news is that anybody who ever worked for Daddy became part of his family.
Wore out people who were half his age.
Bad news that anybody who ever worked for Daddy became part of his family.
The single most intelligent man that I've ever known.
Totally honest and calculatingly devious.
Sheer raw brute intelligence.
Could be thoughtful, caring, and
There was
generous.
just this internal engine in him that could not stop.
Tough, demanding.
He was a great intimidator.
All of these opposites clanged together inside.
One doesn't have to move a lot of political actions to know that he was driven by the desire to serve.
He was determined to achieve not a good society, but a great society.
You saw injustice, you saw hunger, you saw America, and he wanted to do something about it.
3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today.
In the very early hours of his presidency,
He laid it out, the entire Great Society, and he never diverged from it.
Will you join in the battle to build the Great Society?
Most of what he proposed, he'd been thinking about for many years, so it was all pent up. And when he became president, it just exploded.
The journey began with President Roosevelt's conviction that a compassionate government cannot ignore the plight of the ill-housed, or the ill-fed, or the ill-clothed.
Johnson saw that government could be a great force to help people who are confronting forces that are too big for them to fight themselves.
And he realizes that this is a chance now for him to, in a sense, complete the New Deal.
Our first objective is to free 30 million Americans from the prison of poverty. Can you help us free these Americans? And if you can, let me hear your voices.
Johnson wins the election in 1964 by a landslide.
Johnson had an enormous amount of political capital, and he didn't hoard it. He used it to get the Great Society in place.
Since he had so many bills and so many committees at the same time, what it required were these huge charts in his office. This was Johnson's domestic equivalent of the war room.
Johnson had the energy and the determination and the tenacity to work on them one by one until we got the numbers we needed, not just to pass the legislation, but to get the Great Society enacted by bipartisan legislation.
My first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry. And they knew, even in their youth, the pain of prejudice.
His heart went out to the Hispanics and the blacks who were in such a biased world. He wanted to give people a chance to succeed, to fulfill themselves, because that was the story of his life.
As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. But really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
In my estimation, he made one of the most meaningful speeches than any American president have made in modern time.
There's no president since Abraham Lincoln that comes close to the achievements of LBJ on civil rights.
What he does changes the face of America forever. It is a social revolution that we'll never go back on.
He opened up the political process. He made real the essence of our democratic ideal.
All of Johnson was quite visible in his early years. The intensity, the drive, the native intelligence.
From the time he was young, he had this sense that if he could outwork everybody, he could get where he wanted to go.
He understood from the start that this was a city that was a magnet for ambitious people.
He had an incredible sense of the jugular of every member of Congress.
He could remember where every senator stood on different issues. What were their vulnerabilities? What were their strengths? What did they need in their district?
He had telephones everywhere he could possibly be, which meant that there was never a free hour when he wasn't calling some congressman, some businessman, some labor leader to get something done.
Work for him was just the most natural sort of thing. And the people around him were sort of driven to work 24/7 if he needed them to do it.
Part of the LBJ treatment was physical.
You knew when Lyndon started breathing in your mouth that you were finished.
But much more importantly was the mental part of the treatment.
We used to say people are moved by love and fear, and the trick is to put the right combination together.
He would frequently take his fingers and press into your chest, or in some cases even almost lift you up some by your lapel, where I find myself in most cases saying, yes, sir, Mr. President, whatever I can do to make it happen.
Well, when Johnson came to the presidency, the United States was deeply enmeshed in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and China. There was a kind of feeling of a life and death struggle with communism, and it was global.
Since 1954, every American president has offered support to the people of South Vietnam, and I intend to keep that promise.
There was a worldview that was shared by most of the decision makers from the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson era, that wherever there was a potential for a communist uprising, we had to be there.
Johnson knew that he was risking his great society, the lives of thousands of young Americans, and yet he went ahead because he felt that national security was at stake.
I remember him saying, if I could just sit across a table from Ho Chi Minh, we could work this out.
But it wasn't that easy on a world scale.
I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. And it's just the biggest damn mess.
It was a man absolutely tortured by the realization that he just simply didn't have the power or the vision available to him to find a way out of this thing.
In the end, it destroyed his body as well as his heart, knowing that so many of his achievements would now be shadowed by the war.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
And by then, it was really clear that continuing to bomb, continuing to do everything we could to pacify areas, it wasn't working. He said, well, I don't know, I may not run. And I said, you have to run. You're only one of the politicians who could get things achieved. And he said, you've got it exactly backwards. I'm the only one who can. I've asked too much of Congress. We're like an old man and woman. We've asked too much of each other.
I shall not seek the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Johnson thought that pulling out of the presidential race in 1968 would allow him to devote all of his time and energy to trying to get peace in Vietnam.
Lyndon Johnson was giving his political life, which for someone like Lyndon Johnson was really life itself, in an effort to advance the force of peace.
Every president lives not only with what is, but with what has been and what could be.
We sometimes shy away from the exercise of power, and sometimes the way he used it might have been tough. But the overall end was to try and make life better for people.
I want to be the president who educated young children to the wonders of their world.
He understood that education was the path to a better life in America.
I want to be the president who helped the poor to find their own way.
When Johnson fought for education and to reduce poverty, he was really carrying out his true calling.
I want to be the president who helped to end hatred among his fellow men.
He was an extraordinary man, full of human failings, but full of this incredible resolve to try to make America a better place than what he found.